There is a question almost no CEO ever asks, not because they don't want the answer, because the answer has the power to change everything. If you remove your title tomorrow, would people still follow your leadership? Or have they simply learned how to follow your authority? Those, my friends, are not the same thing. Compliance looks remarkably similar to commitment until the pressure comes, until the crisis comes, until you're no longer in the room. And that's when the truth quietly reveals itself. After more than 25 years and tens of thousands of conversations with predictable CEOs, founders, board members, investors, and executive teams, I've come to believe something. The most dangerous leaders aren't the ones people refuse to follow. They're the ones who never realize people stopped believing long before they stopped complying. And that is where today's conversation begins. Welcome to Quick Tips from the C-Suite. I'm Travis Thomas, one of the founders of Thomas & Taylor Search Partners and Thomas & Taylor Partners Holding. This podcast exists for one very simple reason: to have the conversations leadership rarely allows us to have. Not conversations about titles or power or authority. Conversations about influence, trust, identity, and the invisible forces that determine whether people simply work for us or willingly choose to follow us. And today's conversation may be one of the most confronting we've had yet because it's built around a single question, one that every leader should be courageous enough to ask. Would people still choose to follow me if they no longer had to? Let's begin. I've spent years asking leaders one question: what does a great team look like? The answers are almost always the same. They're aligned, committed, accountable, high performing, collaborative, engaged. But I've started asking a different question. What does a team look like when they're only pretending to follow you? That's a much harder question because from the outside, the two can look almost identical. Both teams show up, both teams attend the meetings, both teams hit deadlines, both teams nod in agreement, both teams execute the plan. But underneath, they're completely different. One team is committed, the other is compliant. One speaks because they care, the other stays quiet because they've learned. One is emotionally invested, the other is professionally obligated. One follows the mission, the other follows the organizational chart. And those, my friends, are not the same thing. Here's what I've learned after 25 years. People rarely wake up one morning and decide to stop following a leader. It happens much more quietly, conversation by conversation, meeting by meeting, reaction by reaction, until eventually people stop bringing their best thinking forward, not because they stopped caring, because somewhere along the way they stopped believing it mattered. And that's one of the most expensive moments in leadership. Not when people leave the company, when they stay, but leave emotionally. Because you can replace talent, but it's extremely hard to replace belief. And this is a phrase I often hear: I've got a great team. Maybe. But here's the question I would ask you: do you have a team that agrees with you or a team that believes in you? Those are profoundly different organizations. Agreement is easy, belief has to be earned. Agreement disappears under pressure, belief becomes stronger. Agreement follows authority, belief follows trust. Agreement asks, what do you want me to do? Belief asks, how can we make this better? One creates employees, the other creates stewards. And perhaps that's the first great misunderstanding of leadership. We think we're trying to build followers. I don't think we are. I think we're trying to build owners, people who care about the mission as deeply as we do, people who tell us the truth even when it's extremely uncomfortable, people who challenge ideas because they care more about the outcome than they do about protecting our ego. That's not followership. That's stewardship. And stewardship can never be demanded. It can only be inspired. So before we go any further in this podcast, I'd like you to consider one question. Not about your company, not about your executive team, about you. Yes, about you. If your title disappeared tomorrow, what part of your leadership would remain? Because the answer to that question may reveal the difference between authority and influence. And there's something else I've come to believe after thousands, actually tens of thousands of conversation with predictable leaders. People don't respond to the leadership we believe we're demonstrating. They respond to the leadership they experience. And those are rarely the same thing. Think about that. Every leader has intentions. I want my team to challenge me. I want honest feedback. I want people to take ownership. I want innovation. People don't respond to our intentions. They respond to our reactions. Every interpretation, every impatient glance, every defensive explanation, every meeting where we answer too quickly, every moment where we shut down the idea without realizing we actually had. People notice that and people adapt, not because they're fearful, because they're intelligent. They begin asking themselves, what is safe here? What gets rewarded here? What gets remembered here? What gets people promoted here? What gets people ignored here? Those questions shape culture far more than any mission statement ever will. And here's the paradox. Leaders often believe they're creating trust while unintentionally creating caution. The executive team still agrees, the meetings still move quickly, the numbers still look good. From the outside, everything appears healthy until one day a decision fails. Customer leaves, an acquisition struggles, a key leader resigns, and everyone says, why didn't anyone see this coming? The truth? Someone usually did. They just didn't believe it was worth saying. And that's one of the most expensive sentences an organization will ever write. Not in a report, not on a balance sheet, but in its culture. And I've started asking CEOs a question that almost always creates silence. It's one of my favorites. When was the last time someone completely changed your mind? Not politely challenged you, not added to your thinking, changed your mind. And if it's been a long time, don't assume you're becoming wiser. Ask yourself something much harder. Have I become more difficult to influence? Because the greatest leaders never lose their ability to lead. They refuse to lose their willingness to be led. Because the greatest leaders never lose their ability to lead. They refuse to lose their willingness to be led. The greatest leaders never lose their willingness to be led by truth, by wisdom, by better ideas, by people with different experiences, by someone with less authority and more insight. That's not weakness. That's leadership at its highest expression. And there comes a moment when every leader has to choose. Do I want people to admire me, or do I want people to trust me enough to risk disappointing me? Because those are very different cultures, my friend. One produces applause, the other produces truth. And only one of them builds organizations that outlive the leader. And maybe that's the real work, not becoming someone people follow, become someone people never have to pretend to follow. So I'd like to ask you, the listening audience, a question. And I don't want you to answer it quickly. Sit in this one. Just sit in it. When people walk into a meeting with you, what are they preparing for? Think about that. Not what are they preparing to discuss? What are they preparing for emotionally? Are they preparing to contribute or to protect themselves? Are they preparing to challenge your thinking or to carefully choose their words? Are they preparing to create something extraordinary or simply survive another meeting? Because people don't prepare for your title, they prepare for your patterns. They know what excites you, they know what frustrates you, they know which ideas you'll embrace, they know which ideas you'll quietly dismiss, they know when you'll interrupt, they know when you're going to defend, they know when you'll stop listening. Long before we understand our leadership, our people have already adapted to it. Trust me, one of the greatest misconceptions in leadership is believing people tell us who we are. They don't. People tell us what feels safe, and there's a profound difference. If disagreement feels expensive, people become agreeable. If honesty feels risky, people become political. If curiosity isn't welcomed, innovation quietly disappears. Not because people lack courage, because they become students of our behavior. And every leader is teaching. The question is, what are you teaching people about being honest with you? Years ago, I heard a CEO say something that has stayed with me ever since he said it. I don't understand why nobody brings me problems anymore. And I remember thinking, maybe they do, just not to you. They bring them to each other. They bring them into the parking lot after work. They bring them into the hallway. They bring them to the text messages after the meeting because every organization has two conversations, the one that happens in the room and the one that happens after it. The second conversation is usually the honest one. And that's the uncomfortable truth. The quality of the second conversation is almost always a reflection of the leadership. I sometimes wonder if the greatest measure of leadership isn't what people say while we're present, but what they say when we're absent. Do they defend the mission? Do they build trust? Do they carry the culture forward? Or does the energy change the moment we leave the room? Because if influence only exists while we're in the room, it was never influence, it was authority. Authority enters with you when you enter the room. Influence remains after you've gone. Authority enters with you. Influence remains after you're gone. And that's the difference, my friend. One controls behavior, the other transforms belief. And believe is what people choose when no one's watching. So perhaps the question isn't, do people follow me? Maybe the better question we should be asking ourselves is, who are people becoming because they've been led by me? Are they becoming more courageous, more thoughtful, more honest, more capable, more confident? Or have they become better at pretending? Because if people have learned to perform leadership instead of experience it, they're not the ones who need to change first. We are. I've also come to believe there are two different kinds of leaders. The first knows how to build followers. The second builds leaders. One creates dependence, the other creates freedom. One needs to remain at the center, the other quietly moves to the edge and watches others rise. That may be the greatest transition a leader ever makes. And when you're young in leadership, we're trying to prove ourselves. We want to be respected. We want to be trusted. We want to be competent. We want to demonstrate that we're capable. So we speak first. We solve quickly. We answer confidently. We become indispensable. And for a season in our leadership journey, that serves us. But eventually, leadership asks something much, much different. It asks to stop proving and start producing, not results, leaders. Because if everyone still depends on you years after you started leading them, you haven't multiplied leadership. You've centralized it. Think about the greatest leaders you've ever known, the ones that changed your life. Do you remember them because they had all the answers, or because they somehow made you believe you could become more than you thought possible? That's the difference, my friends. Great leaders don't create followers, they create belief, belief in the mission, belief in each other, belief in what's possible, and perhaps most importantly, belief in ourselves. I don't think extraordinary leaders walk into a room asking, how do I get these people to believe in me? I think they ask something much more courageous. How do I help these people believe in themselves? Because if your leadership requires everyone else's confidence, it will always be fragile. But if your leadership builds confidence in others, it becomes exponential. That's how cultures change. Not because one extraordinary leader arrived, because that leader refused to make the organization about them. And I've noticed something extremely fascinating. The leaders people remember most aren't always the most charismatic or the loudest or the smartest. They're often the ones who made everyone around them better, safer, more courageous, more curious, more honest, more willing to speak, more willing to lead. And when those leaders leave, their influence doesn't disappear, it expands exponentially, because they were never trying to collect followers. They were creating stewards, people who carry the culture long after the founder leaves, long after the CEO retires, long after the board changes. That's legacy, not being remembered, being reproduced. Think about that. Leadership isn't measured by how many people follow you. It's measured by how many leaders exist because of you. So maybe, just maybe, we've been asking the wrong question all along. Not do people follow me, but when I leave the room, does leadership remain? Does courage remain? Does trust remain? Does curiosity remain? Does ownership remain? Does honesty remain? Because if those things disappear when you do, people weren't following your leadership, they were managing your presence. And those are not the same thing. And perhaps that's the simple invitation today. Stop trying to become someone people admire. Become someone who quietly gives other people permission to become extraordinary. Because admiration creates distance, permission creates transformation, and transformation is what leadership was always meant to do. And maybe the greatest compliment a leader could ever receive isn't, we couldn't have done it without you. Maybe it's, because of you, we discovered we could. As we close out today, I'd like to leave you with a thought, not about leadership, about legacy. Someday, you'll walk out of a meeting for the very last time, and you won't know it's the last. Someone else will eventually sit in your chair. Trust me. I've watched it time and time again. They're going to lead your team. They're going to cast your vision. They're going to make the decision. because life moves on. Organizations evolve, and that's the way it should be. The question is, what will remain because you were there? Will people remember your authority, or will they remember how you made them feel? Will they remember your title, or the confidence you helped them discover within themselves? Will they remember your strategy, or the courage you gave them to think differently? Because I've become to believe the greatest leaders don't leave behind followers. They leave behind leaders, people who tell the truth, people who take ownership, people who choose courage over comfort, people who protect the culture even when no one is watching, not because they have to, because somewhere along the way, someone believed in them before they actually believed in themselves. And maybe that's the real invitation of leadership, not to become someone people admire, but to become someone who quietly changes the way people see themselves. Think about the leaders who changed your life. I doubt they were perfect. I doubt that they had every answer. I doubt that they won every battle. But I'll bet they gave you something. Permission. Permission to think bigger. Permission to speak. Permission to fail. Permission to lead. Permission to become. And that influence is one of the few things in life that continues growing long after you've left the room. So before you walk into your next board meeting, your next executive team meeting, your next conversation with someone who looks to you for leadership, don't ask yourself, how do I get people to follow me? Ask something much more courageous. Who are people becoming because they experienced me today? Because perhaps that's the only question that really matters. Thank you for joining me today. If this conversation challenged the way you think about leadership, I hope you'll share it with another leader, because organizations don't change when strategies change. Organizations change when leaders do. Until next time, lead from your heart, live from your soul, and remember, the greatest leader you will ever become has been within you.